We just saw a beautiful film by Elsa Bray, especially commissioned as part of Transmediale. Le Sanglier exposes the fiction of human sovereignty over nature through a pack of algorithmically controlled boars who are roaming the French countryside. But now I'd like to introduce you to our next talk today by Elaine Gan, Farming Otherwise in the Last Wetlands of California. This talk explores how rice fields are compromised landscapes that emerge from multiple interweaving histories and violent exterminations, and whose future depends on attunement and compromise with more than human infrastructures and agency. So I just want to introduce Elaine. Elaine Gan is a theorist and artist who engages with more than human worlds through the lens of temporality. Gan directs the Multi-Species World Building Lab and teaches at New York University. And she has some lovely bookshelves there in the background. Welcome, Elaine.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Can you hear me? Just want to make sure.
Yeah, we can hear you fine.
Okay, great. So thank you for the invitation. Thanks especially to Nora, Danny, Paul, Elise, and many people backstage who made this event and my participation today possible. So I'm delighted to join you. I'm calling in from New York City, where we are having a huge snowstorm. So, okay, in conversation a few months ago, the curators invited me to consider the possibilities and impossibilities of refusal, specifically how refusal opens up to restructuring and compromise. How refusal, I think, as I understood the prompt, how refusal might invite ways of getting along across radical differences, or of getting along without killing each other. So I'm going to talk about the subject of my research in recent years, which is a flowering grass that most of you will know as rice. In many parts of the world, and particularly in the last 2 to 3 centuries, rice as a crop lives less like a plant and more like a machine. So I'm quite interested in how and why that happened, the unintended and intended effects of that transformation, and ultimately how we might imagine these relations otherwise, or how we might plant, farm, and feed differently. So by engaging with rice over the next 25 or so minutes, I'm going to invite you to consider the term compromise in at least 2 ways. First, the rice seeds and rice fields that I'll talk about are really compromised bodies and landscapes that emerge from multiple histories and violent apparatuses of extermination. And second, the futures of rice, their capacity to continue producing, feeding, and surviving really depends on a capacity for compromise, for negotiation and attunement with more than human infrastructures and agencies, rather than an increase in techno-scientific and capital-intensive control. Okay, so let's begin. I'm going to try to share my screen and start a slideshow. Okay. All right, so there are 4 parts to my paper, and they're organized around 4 verbs or 4 scenes. First, 2 will describe rice farming and sorting or classification. And the 3rd and 4th will zoom in on rice fields in the Central Valley, the heartland of a multi-billion-dollar agrotechnological food industry. These rice fields, some of which you see on your screen, are now among the last remaining wetlands of California, which is where the title of my paper today comes from. So here's the first scene, planting better futures. So planting seeds in soil, seeding rice fields so that crops might grow and perhaps flower and flourish, is an act of imagining and making a claim for an ongoing or future relation. No human farmer plants without some expectation of harvest. Planting requires various kinds of calculations and compromises. Practices of planting imagine better days to come because they have done so in the past. But exactly what counts as a better future? For purveyors of industrialized commercial agriculture, better means more yield and higher grain productivity. For farmers, otherwise, better means a capacity to live together, to sustain lasting relations with kin and land. So there's a vast spectrum of what defines a better future, and these materialize or take form as hundreds of thousands of rice cultivars, ranging from indigenous varieties and foraged wild grains to colonial breeds, state certified seeds, and genetically modified hybrids. Each cultivar, which means a variety of rice, so each cultivar embodies many histories, many cycles of coordination, experimentation, compromise, and adaptation in order to survive in different futures. Each cultivar depends on its particular assemblage of relations. Now, the practices of planting, the cultivars and the assemblages are quite different depending on where you are. So, for example, in many parts of Asia and Africa, planting rice may be done by hand in small machines. In Northern California, planting is done from the air. So these are done by single engine GPS guided airplanes that swoop across fields, dropping seeds from high above the ground, and they cover thousands of hectares in just a few days. In Australia, tractors and machines drill the seeds into dry ground, whereas in Japan, some use robotic seeders that plant seedlings while at the same time discharging fertilizers and insecticides. It's a kind of a cyborg operation. So my point is that there's a very vast spectrum of cultivars and the kinds of practices and farmers they require. Some of these cultivators are human, some are machinic, some molecular, some microbial, some multinational, like corporations. So cultivators select the varieties that they want to see again. Some because of subsistence, others for profit, some out of delight, and others out of respect for kin and elders. Rice is what anthropologist Anne-Marie Moll might call a body multiple. Rice cultivars are made and remade through relations that they are in the process of making and remaking. Thus, a plurality of bodies mingle season after season, coordinating and compromising in response to many other bodies, rhythms, and cycles. Okay, the second verb is sorting, and that's sorting racialized seeds. Early in my research, I was struck by one of the ways in which rice research institutes organize their seed collections. The largest one for rice is called the International Rice Research Institute, or IRRI, IRI, located in the Philippines. It was founded by the Rockefeller and Ford Foundations in the 1960s. Rice is classified into 4 categories. 1, modern or elite or improved hybrids. Then 2nd, traditional or native land races. 3rd, weedy relatives. And 4th, wild seeds. Now, these distinctions represent degrees and hierarchies of human intervention. Moderns are bred intensively to have highly productive traits, for example, fast growth, disease resistance, short stature, etc. They're also bred to have predictable growth patterns in different types of locations. Number 2, traditional land races are cultivated by local farmers and indigenous groups. They're highly variable and improvisational, linked to specific places and collective ways of life. Then weeds are matter out of place, they're noxious and destined for rapid disposal. Lastly, wild seeds fall outside of the domesticated sphere, and they're valuable for their genetic diversity and future profits. So classifications have consequences, and I was struck by their racialized and temporal orientations. Modern seeds are associated with Western progress and the promise of productivity and future abundance. Moderns are high-yielding seeds that will fix world hunger and ensure universal peace based on Western standards. Whereas traditional land races belong to a vanishing past, they're heirlooms of ancestral tastes, aromas, and reified cultural and colored non-white heritage. Weeds and wilds are incommensurable, biding their untimely times in seed banks and genetic labs until one trait or another might be reintroduced to supercharge the future of modern capital-intensive seeds. So these racialized classifications undergird research at institutes that produce perhaps as much as 75% of all the rice grown around the world. So why does making this connection matter? I argue that it's because equating moderns with better futures rationalizes the assemblages that go along with them. And that means chemical fertilizers and pesticides, dams and irrigation canals, erosion of genetic diversity, and the dispossession of non-white, non-moderns. So equating moderns with better futures rationalizes harm and extermination. These are disruptions to major cycles, for example, cycles of nitrogen, water, carbon, sunlight, through which all life in this planet is possible. And disruption is not confined to a single effect. When relations are broken or compromised, multiple others emerged and they become more and more difficult to control. Disruptions or breakdowns give way to novel formations, and many are disastrous. For example, algal blooms, viruses, insects, fungal blasts, bacterial blight that now overrun many of the agricultural fields we rely on today. So among the traditional land races that are stored in this research institute at Erie are over 300 varieties cultivated by farmers in the Ifugao Mountain provinces of northern Philippines. The seeds you're seeing here were gathered by anthropologists working with Ifugao collaborators in the 1960s through the 1980s, and they were cataloged for conservation at Erie. These traditional seeds coexist or are contemporary with modern seeds, with those classified as modern seeds. But these traditionals are framed in a very different way. They're framed as part of a remote past. So these Ifugao rice terraces or rice fields, where the seeds are from, are listed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And they're valued not for their productivity, but for their beauty and harmony, representative of an ancient civilization. Meanwhile, fields are part of a global techno-scientific consortium for agricultural innovation, signifying human mastery or techno-scientific management over the future. So my point is that we need to pay attention to these maneuvers and reassemble these racialized constructions in order to start imagining how farming might be otherwise. Okay, the third scene is embodying war and peace. July 16, 1945 is the date of the first nuclear bomb test, codenamed Trinity, in New Mexico as part of the Manhattan Project. This is the cloud, the mushroom cloud, 10 seconds after the bomb was detonated. Science studies scholar Joseph Masco marks this date as the beginning of what he calls the age of fallout. There were 215 detonations carried out in the United States between 1945 and 1962. Masco writes that, and I quote, "We are living in the unintended environmental aftermath of cumulative industrial projects, a process that remakes bodies and atmospheres on a planetary scale and does so in ways that we have yet to fully account for," end quote. So a critical point that Masco makes in naming the age of fallout is that while these detonations radically change the planet, they simultaneously gave rise to Earth system science, or the scientific tools you and I now use to assess planetary phenomenon. That we have a conception of the Earth as a planetary system is an effect, or one of many effects, of fallout. So this is a diagram that I like very much, taken from Masco's essay. Masco notes that fallout was used to study global wind patterns. Researchers tracked the global distribution of strontium-90, demonstrating that the radioactivity absorbed by soil doesn't stay put and it doesn't just disappear. It eventually makes its way around the entire planet into the bodies of plants and animals, and of course, humans. So along with Earth system science also came a new kind of agriculture. Technologies for war, and that's material, conceptual, discursive technologies, or what makes 250 nuclear detonations seem reasonable, also enabled a new kind of crop science and breeding, or what passes as our food and agriculture today. In the 1950s, the US government under Eisenhower launched a program called Atoms for Peace, essentially a media campaign to displace public fears of nuclear disaster with promises of peace and abundance through nuclear reactors and atomic energy. So one important offshoot of the Atoms for Peace was a breeding technique of radiation-induced mutation in crop plants. Let me connect this back to rice in California. So you're looking at early cultivars planted at the rice experiment station at Biggs, which is north of Sacramento. Again, that's northern California. The rice station was opened in 1912 and it released its first cultivar in 1917. That was called Calusa, and that's on the left side of your screen. Up until the 1950s, rice yields in the area were pretty average, about 2 to 3 years. With the introduction of synthetic nitrogen and fertilizers and pesticides after the Second World War, crop yields were expected to rise. But California rice plants, or calrose in short, grew tall. This meant that when fertilizers were applied, the plants produced a greater number of plumper or fatter grains. And that meant that they eventually toppled over from the increased weight. The problem, which is called lodging, made harvesting with machines difficult. So imagine a large plow making its way through heaps of long stalks lying on the ground, right? It's just easier. It's just easier for machines to cut upright, short stalks. So hearing about the modern seeds and high yields at Erie in the Philippines, California breeders attempted to cross varieties with Erie and its semi-dwarf or short varieties. But Erie seeds came from a different evolutionary line, and they were adapted to tropical, not temperate climates like California. So this posed a problem. How could the bodies of tall calrose plants, like what you see on the right, how could those plants be made to grow short? In 1971, a young geneticist at the US Department of Agriculture named J. Neil Rutger began experimenting with the technique I mentioned earlier. It's called radiation-induced mutation breeding. So by exposing calrose seeds to gamma rays from a cobalt-60 source, Rutger could tinker with their genetic composition. Rutger produced a calrose mutation, which you see in the photos here. It's a mutation that grew short and sturdy stalks, a dwarf form that was more amenable to fertilizers and machines than the other older California varieties. So this irradiated mutant, no longer tall and pliant, but now height compromised, was named calrose 76. Commemorating 1976, the year of its release. So since calrose 76, California varieties are, for the most part, short or dwarf varieties. They, of course, are also bred to have other traits that directly affect the crop's yield and profitability. For example, disease resistance, cold tolerance, milling quality, grain appearance, and taste. So there are many other traits. But shortness is the trait that's particularly interesting for me because it was inspired by Erie's modern varieties, which themselves emerged out of American and German logics, material histories, and industrial schemes that were imposed onto tropical Southeast Asian plants. So the shortness trait in rice crops becomes possible through multiple technologies of war and peace, and it entangles rice varieties in California with modern varieties in Southeast Asia. So bodies are compromised similarly across different sides of the Pacific Ocean. So since the 1970s, rice yields in California have tripled, rising to an average of about 10 to 12 tons per hectare, where they used to be 2 to 3 tons per hectare. Right? Now, I need to note that I'm not saying that the increase is entirely because of shortness. Right? That's not the only cause. Many factors have certainly contributed to the transformation of California rice yields. But I'm going to simplify those many complicated histories so that I can just talk about this next and final scene. So this last scene is called Inhabiting More Than Human Year. Like the 400 kinds of specialty crops that now grow in California, rice is a product of modern technoscience. Central Valley rice fields are highly mechanized. They're capital-intensive assemblages that are singularly focused on yield and scaffolded by intra-acting violences of settler colonialism, racialized capitalism, and environmental degradation. Yet, unlike any other crop, rice is semi-aquatic, and it grows in wet, irrigated fields. This means that the presence of water allows rice fields to double as multi-species wetlands. Now, how did this happen? In 1991, the burning of rice stubble after harvest was banned by the state of California because of growing concerns about the health effects of pollution. So rice growers began flooding their fields post-harvest to get rid of their residual stubble. It allowed them to accelerate the decomposition of straw. So the flooded fields became temporary feeding and breeding grounds for millions of migratory birds who make their annual journeys along the Pacific Flyway between the Arctic tundra in North America down to South America. The birds, famished from their transcontinental flight, ate the leftover stubble and metabolizing that fertilized the soil. By cleaning up and enriching fields for the next season's plantings, the migrating birds proved to be very useful, more than human labor, and thus earned a claim to the wintertime hospitality of rice farmers. In the last 3 decades since the banning of rice burns, activities for the production of commercial grain and the sustenance of wild bird migrations have taken place in the very same fields. From April until October, fields are planted with rice. When grains are harvested from the fields in November until February or March, rice fields are flooded and become surrogate wetlands full of stubble, weeds, and insects that can serve as bird feed for multitudes of long-billed shorebirds like avocets and sandpipers, long-legged waders such as herons, egrets, and cranes, and between 6 and 10 million gregarious ducks and long-necked geese. So every winter for the last 30 years, approximately 2/3 of all the rice fields in California or in the Central Valley become breeding and feeding grounds for these birds. Farmers, eager to shed their public image as heavy polluters of air, water, and soil, have embraced the practice and identify increasingly as growers of what's now called the environmental crop. So this is a screenshot of the homepage of the California rice industry's website, right? And so they're really branding themselves as the environmental crop. So the question this raises for me is this environmental crop that is part of a massive agro-technological machine that I just described, is it something to support or refuse? When bird migrations peak in December and January, their flocks fill the crisp blue California skies and the expansive grid of compromised crops and fields below. The birds are an enchanting and breathtaking sight that one wishes could last forever. It's what theorist Deborah Bird Rose would have described as an exuberant, life-affirming shimmer. But Rose also teaches that this moment belongs to a bundle of troubled histories and the increasingly endangered realities of disregarded and unloved others. It's a powerful reminder that these magnificent creatures are all that remain of 40 to 60 million birds that used to travel through vast expanses of wetlands, forests, and grasslands. These ecological relations are nearly all gone, exterminated by anthropogenic disturbance and modern industrial development. Now, birds are among the oldest creatures of what modernity has classified as wilderness, as the wild. Since the Miocene, birds have evolved forms, activity patterns, and sensory ecologies in response to seasonal cycles and environmental changes, like glacial advance and retreat. Migration is an evolutionary strategy for living with changes that repeat somewhat regularly and predictably. Birds use their wings and senses in a great variety of ways to maintain access to food and safe habitats as these become available in remote locations during different times of the year. So in sophisticated and mind-boggling ways, birds travel, birds migrate in order to stay home or to stay within conditions that are most favorable and familiar all year round. Historian William Cronon puts this nicely when writing about the Pacific Flyway. He notes that and I quote, their home environments exist on a geographical scale that is hemispheric in scope, unquote. So bird cycles inhabit different scales of place and time. They're neither smaller nor larger than human cycles, but they're just ontologically different. People move in the seasonal flyways and evolving lifeways of birds, just as birds weave in and out of human activities and landscapes. But people and birds do not inhabit each other's patterns and cycles in exactly the same way at exactly the same time and place. So a very important challenge lies in figuring out how to trace our multiple overlaps, intersections, and collisions, what has been compromised and refused, as well as what is yet to come, what may still require other forms of compromise and refusal. So I'm going to close with the image that I started with. These are commercial rice fields that are now among the last wetlands in California. Droughts and wildfires that you may have heard of in recent years now threaten these lands. I've tried to offer a sense of how they work through 4 verbs or relational practices. That is, planting futures, sorting racialized seeds, embodying war and peace, and inhabiting a more than human year. That's certainly not all that happens here, but I hope I have at least opened up a small space where differences and entanglements and complexities might become a bit more sensible. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Elaine, for a fantastic talk. Thank you so much.